So, as Abby and I were figuring out how to execute this episode specifically, we found ourselves confronting like problems of time and metabolizing time and being able to kind of maintain, well, like an even keel, as it were, or some kind of posture of, let's call it
equanimity.
Yeah, bare minimum sanity, at least in terms of metabolizing events and thinking about what's outside the room and what isn't, and all these various resonant, overdetermined concerns. And I felt like we couldn't not acknowledge that, well, when this comes out, be a couple weeks after we record it. And that means that our recording it now in the past for our audience is happening on the weekend in which, or just after the weekend in which the U.S., well, it's another problem of time, initiated a new phase in its war in Iran, or began a new war in Iran, or at some point I feel like I'm like talking about like the Punic Wars in ancient Mediterranean history. Like, who knows, like how future historians will divvy it up, but also to the point that I wanted to kind of just thematize with you, who knows what will or will not happen in terms of sequence of events, and maybe we'll return to negotiations, or hell, maybe we'll get a mushroom cloud. Who knows? But that in its own way kind of thematizes this problem of our individual subject positions metabolizing world historical events and feeling the need to speak to them without any clarity, without at least certainty, closure, or being able to say, this is over now. That war is done. Now we're on to a new war. Or it's a temporality that is, well, it's certainly not the way trauma works or memory works. And it poses some challenges for, well, basic sanity, but also like moral intervention and having some kind of witness and voice. And, perversely enough, this may be all the more grateful to be talking to you specifically. But I just wanted to say that and situated us in time so that we can step out of time at the same time.
I really appreciate your bringing in the temporal dimension, because, in some ways, this is not how what you were describing about the scramble of when this will be listened to and how things live after the time of their recording or the time of their conceptualization, and how history judges them, or what other kinds of materials are available for us to understand them retrospectively, means that everything is unstable and everything can be done differently. And this is also the condition of possibility for so much of the work that we do politically, but also in the clinic. And at the same time, as you were struggling to find with what exact works are you going to describe what happened yesterday with Iran, like I've been in touch with a lot of people in Cyprus today about the bombing of many people may not know that Cyprus has, in Cyprus are located a couple of British bases that continue to be British sovereign territory. And the US does not have plain bases in the Mediterranean in the same way, certainly not in Greece, but now they're using the ones in Cyprus. And therefore now Cyprus is being targeted by Iran. And there's been the base was closed earlier today, or planes flew out to protect themselves. Citizens were asked to stay at home. So, even a country that many people don't think about very much in the Swana region, in the Middle East, like the country of Cyprus, all of a sudden comes into the news. So this is the kind of scrambles that can happen at this time. But what I would also say is that as you were looking for the right words of how do you describe what happened yesterday with Iran, with the attack on Iran, there is a progression and a move in a particular direction. However, it may go in the future. We see an intensification of ethno-nationalism. We see an intensification globally of really the West, including the Western dimensions of Israel, joining the West and joining the hegemony of dominant powers, as it has for a very long time. We see that all of that is moving in the same direction, and power is coagulating. It is not becoming more dispersed. It is not becoming more uncertain. If anything, it is doubling down. And that is a kind of direction, even as we don't know exactly how it will play out. And at the same time, there are incredibly powerful domains of resistance. So I love that you're situating us immediately in the geopolitical, because that is so connected to also what's happening in psychoanalysis right now, which wants to understand itself as depoliticized and outside the political domain, and as just observing and having no judgment and no moral compass and no moral principles.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so pleased to welcome our returning guest, Avgi Saketopoulou. An immigrant from Cyprus and Greece, Avgi is a psychoanalyst in New York City. She is on the faculty of the NYU postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis and the 2025 Avenali Chair for the Humanities at UC Berkeley. In 2021, she co-chaired the first US-based conference on the work of Jean Laplanche, and she is the recipient of several prizes, including twice JAPA's annual Essay Prize, the first Tiresias Prize, and Division 39's Scholarship Award. Avgi is the founder of the Cypriot and Greek chapters of the Palestine Mental Health Network and co-founder of the Psychoanalytic Hub for Online Liberatory Education, aka P-Hole. And side note, you should all check out the really exciting work that new organization is doing. Avgi is author of Sexuality Beyond Consent, Risk, Race, Traumatophilia. She's co-author with Anne Pellegrini of Gender Without Identity, in critical conversation with Dominique Scarfone in The Reality of the Message, Psychoanalysis in the Wake of Jean Laplanche, and she's currently completing a manuscript provisionally entitled The Offer of Sadism, Expenditure, Austerity Logics, and the Anti-Reparative Turn. Avgi, welcome back to the show. We're so grateful to be able to be in conversation with you today.
So delighted to be back. Thank you for having me.
Avgi, many of our listeners will know your work from books like Sexuality Beyond Consent and Gender Without Identity. In fact, I would say that since we had you and Anne Pellegrini on to talk about Gender Without Identity, it is maybe our most cited book from guests that come on the show.
What an honor.
Far and away, truly.
Love that book, have taught
Amazing
it
book.
since it came out. Yeah, just incredible piece of writing. But you're a practicing clinician as well as a prolific writer. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the themes and preoccupations that run throughout your writing and thinking?
I have a great interest in thinking about gender and sexuality and thinking about processes of race and racialization, which I approach through the rubric of Jean Laplanche, who has been a psychoanalyst to whom I was introduced actually mostly after I finished psychoanalytic training, which is when I started becoming a psychoanalyst, I would say. And Laplanche brought an opening to my thinking that other psychoanalytic theories had not brought, despite having tarried in different psychoanalytic schools of thought. And together with more political issues that I started observing happening in our institutes, and as world events have really pulled me to thinking more about the political. The last years, especially, it's been impossible for me to not become preoccupied and interested in theorizing both psychoanalysis's own relationship with the political and noticing the ways in which psychoanalysis is actually quite scared of approaching some of the most radical and most incisive and meaningful interventions that it's making. It has, I think, a kind of like a love-hate relationship with them, which I don't mean in the sense of ambivalence in the everyday sense of the word, or a back and forth, which I find quite interesting and fascinating in and of itself. So I've been thinking about that also through the domain of aesthetics, like thinking through art, which is another one of my interests, especially performance art and theater.
Part of what makes your work so urgent and bracing, and I think also part of what what makes you a writer who people who aren't necessarily in the psychoanalytic orbit turn to is your engagement with contemporary politics in general and your candor about the political stakes of psychotherapy and the dynamics of contemporary psychoanalytic institutions. Yours is a perspective that refuses to let the theoretical remain just simply a matter of abstraction, and that rigorously puts what analysts do in sessions and what analytic associations do collectively in the context of actually existing social and political conditions. I mean, it's this crucial perspective. People want to hear it. Yet, as you've written and spoken about, you've had a recurrent experience of being alternately invited and then disinvited to speak at a wide variety of institutions. And these experiences are personal, to be sure, but you also read them as institutionally and structurally symptomatic. Before we get into, the sort of meat of this, like the way that a psychoanalytic perspective can illuminate this dynamic, can you give us a little background on these experiences and their patterns, whether they involve the Freud Museum in Vienna, the William Ellenson White Institute, or elsewhere?
One of the things that has been happening in the last couple of years, it's happened within psychoanalysis, but not exclusively so, is people are getting invited to speak about political matters or to participate in an art exhibit or to give a talk about a seemingly unrelated matter whose political opinions are known. And they are invited, even those opinions are known. Oftentimes, I'm thinking about institutions that actually disagree with these political opinions. And then somewhere in the course leading up to the actual event, people get disinvited. And I started observing that in a variety of different contexts, but within psychoanalysis, one of the places where it's played out was the American Psychoanalytic Association, as you may know, like 3 years ago, had an incredibly intense rupture with many resignations as a result of it, mine included. In fact, every person in the program committee who was a person of color resigned as a result of the events that I'm going to describe now, which had to do with the disinvitation, or rather the prohibition, the unprecedented, procedurally speaking, this prohibition on the program committee to invite an Arab colleague who was going to be speaking about Palestine. This is Lara Shiha. And that created a huge crisis on the organization. And the crisis was about how the committee had decided that we're going to invite her. We had not yet, I think, extended the invitation. And then the leadership of the American Psychoanalytic Association came back to the program committee and did something that had historically never been done before. It intervened upon our decision-making capacity, which thus far had been a completely independent body. We were deciding on the speakers and then people were getting invited, and that's how we put together the programs for the event. So the American Psychoanalytics leadership comes to the program committee and says, we want you to suspend that because she's too controversial. This person is too controversial. So here you have, I can say more about what happened around that, but the short version of it is that the committee ended up conceding, I would say relenting or obeying, might be different words that we might use, to this prohibition, and ended up putting together a program that was doing something that was in some way addressing issues around war and conflict, and but in a way that was so depoliticized and so defanged that it actually lost all of the vitality of the program that was going to be put together. And of course, many of us resigned. Eventually, the committee was taken down, and now it functions under the auspices of different rules, which are that the committee no longer has independence in making its academic decisions. And I think this is one way to think about infringement on academic freedom. But one question that arises here that I think is really interesting is, what are the kinds of topics and kinds of issues around which these kinds of exceptions are made?
Yeah.
These kinds of new movements are made. So this is one particular example. Then another, one of the things that you referred to, Abby, was talking about the William Ellenson White Institute, which had organized a colloquium series for the entire year and then disinvited a panel by with again, Dr. Sheeha and Dr. Felucca Taylor. Of course, these events are never really called disinvitations because that's too provocative. I take them to be as such because they're not actually like they don't end up producing a new invitation. They're usually called a pause or a cancellation or a postponement. So that panel gets canceled. Every one of us, I have to say, who participated in that yearly colloquium in doing other panels as part of that colloquium also resigned in protest. The White Institute said nothing to its students, to its members, to its faculty. There was no public conversation about this. The colloquium series just disappeared. Like a disappearing act, a vanishing act that you would think psychoanalysis is precisely well situated to be curious about. But instead, that's not what happened. And I think, I'm not sure on the exact time on this, perhaps a year later, it came up on the listserv. And when candidates protested about not having been told about this, my understanding is that the leadership responded that we didn't think you could handle it. So, infantilization is alive and well in psychoanalysis, even in institutes like the White Institute, which are known to be as progressive and which understand themselves as really progressive. And I think this is a really important part of this. And then with the Freud Museum, I wrote about my own personal experience of having been invited to give an interview to talk about transness and politics as part of their permanent collection. I think it was in 2020, it was several years ago, together with other colleagues who were speaking I was speaking about the relational school, or at least how I understand the relational school through my contact with Laplanche. And so we had established a relationship. And in the summer of 2024, I was invited to come back and do a follow-up interview because in the interim, climate change had intensified and the attacks on trans life, had the vilification of trans life within psychoanalysis had become much more prominent, and to also talk about current wars and conflicts. So at the time, it was the Freud Museum knew where I stand on Palestine, so much so that they explicitly asked me to not wear a kufiya in the interview. And I explained that I wasn't planning on wearing a kufiya, but that raised questions about academic freedom for me. And they said to me, it was really fascinating, kind of like this question of disavowal will also come up, I'm sure. But they said to me, we are not trying to control what you're going to say. As if telling me to not wear a kufiya is not kind of like an infringement of some sort. So we had a conversation. They assured me that I was going to be able to speak, quote unquote, freely and express my opinions as I want them. And then they sent me, as sometimes when you're interviewed, you get by well-prepared interviewers, you get questions in advance of what is going to be discussed. And I got the questions, and one of the questions asked me to comment on current population displacements, people's lives being destroyed by rape, by having to leave their homes, by losing a lot of members of their family. So I wrote back and I said, I will be answering that question. But of course, you have to understand that you can't put this question before me and ask me to not speak about the genocide. I will absolutely be speaking about the genocide. And then I got a really strange response. And that this type of response is actually not unusual in its affective echo, which is I was told that my need rather, to talk about the genocide gives them pause. So now it is all put on me. It is for me to hold. It is my need that I'm imposing on a conversation that really has nothing to do with the genocide. And I'm polluting a conversation about massive displacements and people getting raped and killed and generations being lost. I'm polluting it by talking about the genocide. And at that point, they told me that they would like to put the conversation on pause, like the usual phrasing. And I wrote back and named the disinvitation. And then I was told some version, differently worded version of, we don't understand what you're talking about. We're not disinviting you. In fact, we would like to pivot and have you come back and talk just about transness. And I mean, this kind of pinkwashing move is not rare, and it is actually very connected with a lot of the ways by which conversations about Palestine proceed. The idea that in order to give credence and space and time to one issue, Palestine should be thrown under the bus. So I said that absolutely I would not participate in the pinkwashing, and that's where things were left. So one of the questions that comes up for me around these kinds of issues is, but you know my politics, why invite me? And I actually wrote to the Freud Museum and I said, I think you need to do some serious thinking and some introspection. Forget about me. You have to do some introspection as to why you would invite somebody who from the get-go to whom you had to tell from the get-go, we don't want you wearing a kufiya, and who you will eventually, and very predictably with the kind of question that you're putting before me, will disinvite. And the same goes for my talk at ICP, which was going to be on trans issues, the Institute for Contemporary Psychotherapy in Los Angeles, which advertises itself as and markets itself as being very LGBT friendly, and which invited me to give a talk on trans issues, only to disinvite me 2 months before the talk. In fact, I didn't even get an email disinviting me. They announced it to their community, and I heard about it through the grapevine. So from a personal perspective, these are painful and difficult and stressful situations, knowing how to deal with them, how to respond to them, the fact that they recur. But the perspective that interests me here is a more structural one.
Yes.
Especially in a field that has the tools and is interested or should be interested about how to read moments like this as symptomatic of something. I've been very interested in reading them as symptomatic of processes that the institute, that the organization does not really want to deal with.
Yeah, I would love to hear you tell us a little bit about your thinking about the significance of this phenomenon of invitation and disinvitation, and why institutions don't simply invite speakers that are already in line with their politics. Like, what accounts for the persistence of this? I mean, I can't help but think of it as a sort of like institutional, like Fort Da game. And this is something that was also at work in certain respects in your relationship to the International Journal of Psychoanalysis during the process of publishing what turned into Gender Without Identity. But yeah, I would love to hear you. I mean, I'm thinking about this line where you say, as a psychoanalyst, another question feels even more pressing. If an institution does not want to hear from someone who is pro-Palestine, why invite us in the first place? Why not spare themselves and speakers, for this is a stressful and frustrating process for the disinvitee, and stage the conversation they really want with someone whose politics they already agree with from the start?
If I could just say something with an eye towards people who are listening to this and are trying to find some sort of footing from which they can process their like bafflement, disappointment, horror, frustration, and just even to make heads or tails of this, I kind of want to just, even at the risk of being very crude about this, say that on the one hand, I have colleagues and friends who were historians or anthropologists, and a lot of those professional associations are being riven with enactments and really sort of twisted in ways that are singular to the fields and that use the vocabulary of the fields, but that also clearly interface with these same processes of a refusal to talk about settler colonialism or to acknowledge the existence of trans people, all these things, right? And on some level, some part of me also feels that I've never encountered an institution that is perfectly fair, perfectly functional, and politically righteous all at once, right? I think there's something about institutions that is, put this in scare quotes, crazy and crazy making at the same time, right? Like institutions are not people, but also they're somehow more or less than the sum of their people together. And they're messy and they never quite work right. And, one lesson here might be, well, don't be too don't idealize psychoanalysis, or don't idealize any particular institution or any field, or don't reduce your passion or your interest in that thing to the people who are currently occupying positions of authority in it, right? This is the don't make your heroes problem, but also,
or what Tressie McMillan Cottom calls this, like, the institution won't love you back.
Yeah. And just because someone seems sensitive or they open up a world to you, or they are gatekeepers of a thing that you think you have invested, or that, you feel protective about as having some sort of aspect of the human that lights something in you, that doesn't necessarily mean that the people involved are quote unquote good people, or have coherent politics, or don't make mistakes, or don't, like, I think these are general things that we can say about human beings and, again, en bloc in general. At the same time, Jesus Christ, right? Like I can't help but psychoanalytic institutions, I feel like perhaps these were proprietary of them in some ways, where we want something for this. They've done something for me, and this body of knowledge and this way of thinking means something to me. I don't just want it to do better. I want it to not fuck up so much. And I don't necessarily know if dysfunctional institutions across the board manifest their dysfunction in similarly grotesque way, but there's something about psychoanalytic institutions that when they show their ass, they really show their ass. And even as you, I get some part of me is squirming as you describe these correspondences and like the ways in which it's like, and also good for you, by the way, for twisting the knife back in terms of like, no, maybe you should think about this, right? But that there is this kind of like, there's something very blatant and maybe offensive to me about whether we call it an invitation, where we call it taking a pause, where we call it disinvitation. This is an offense to the gods, right? Like the host-guest relationship is a whatever we choose to call it, and all the different ways psychoanalysts can singularly talk around or not talk about a thing. That's tacky, that's bad form, and it courts the Furies, right? Like, don't do that.
I so love the way you're putting it, because of course I feel the frustration, even though I'm not here to talk about my own personal feeling. It is very frustrating. It is very, like, the word for me is really enraging. But I think that, kind of like Abby was talking about, like, the institutions won't love you back. I think it also calls upon us to think about how the institutions won't save us, because even though it is absolutely true what you're saying, Patrick, that this is not unique to psychoanalysis. This is a dime a dozen. Like, what happens is in so many fields. But what is interesting about psychoanalysis is that do that without thinking about it and without having the critical curiosity about why are we doing that, which psychoanalysis has the tools for, but it does not use,
Yes,
is a particular kind of attack on psychoanalytic thinking. It's interesting because the disinvitation is usually couched in psychoanalytic terms. Too much splitting, too much toxic polarization. We don't want to be fighting. We want to be able to think together. But of course, we want to repair the kind of breaks in our community. But in our professional organizations, and in the larger world, not only in psychoanalysis, would much rather theorize toxic polarization and lament processes for splitting, rather than giving credence to and theorizing our resistive impulses to injustice. So when we are confronted with ethno-nationalist violence, genocide, transphobia, white supremacy in the world, but also in our institutes, in our colleagues, in our conferences, psychoanalysis would reflexively urge the repairing of relational divisions, would urge the coming together in an apolitical unity that prioritizes the lack of conflict at the expense of ethical considerations and of difference. And what's fascinating about that is that this is precisely not what psychoanalysis is about. So on the one hand, it leverages the very terms which it, I think, dams down in order to take the heat out of them. And one of the things that I wanted to add to the earlier part was that I was also going to say in introducing myself that I'm also a clinician, and I'm a full-time clinician, and I sit with patients day in and day out. And one of the things that Laplanche really startled me with and brought me into confrontation with are all the pacified ways in which we think about what happens in the encounter between patient and analyst, and all of the ways in which so many theories of countertransference actually work towards organizing something, ordering something, and talking around the intensities of what can happen in the consulting room. So Laplanche really insists for how the analytic situation opens up the possibilities for the reopening of the enigmatic, encounter of the reopening of the enigmatic communication. And that means that not just meaning, but also forces of binding, but also forces of unbinding are invited into the room. And this kind of invitation, perhaps that's one way to think, Patrick, of what you were saying earlier about what it means to invite, that you don't just invite to cohere or to learn something in peace and to preserve the pacification of conversation under the rubric of some rational, reasonable exchange, that you also invite forces of unbinding. And I think my theorization, I've been really interested, as you know, about this invitations. And my theorization is that on the one hand, these invitations are offered to people who disagree with you precisely because these people have an appeal, not just because they are progressive and you want progressive cred, which also happens. I do think that that's a thing, not just because they can help you launder some other violence that you've done in some other domain by appearing that you are more justice oriented in this other domain, but also and especially because, like, I've been thinking a lot about crisis also with Walter Benjamin, and what it kind of like how he talks about how our primary preoccupation in resisting fascism would be how to bring a state of emergency. And I think institutions, organizations feel that they're sagging, that they're sagging towards their imperative, that they're sagging towards kind of like a very toneless, spineless understanding of the depressive position or ongoing dialogue or ongoing conversation that actually deadens them. Forget about, I'm not even talking about remaining relevance. It makes psychoanalysis so flat and so, frankly, boring and uninteresting. It takes out of psychoanalysis its vitality. So I think that we're invited back because people sense that we are going to bring that energy of unbinding. But that doesn't mean that an institution that invites that can also tolerate the anxiety and the dysregulation that that kind of encounter can produce. And I think that that's when disinvitations happen.
Yeah.
When they realize that you're there to do the thing and not just to talk the talk, doing and not just saying.
And that you're going to, by your very presence, you're going to contravene the sort of like liberal discursive norms that are a kind of, unstated condition of these conversations.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And by, what you're saying makes me also think of your brilliant way, I thought, of describing the disinvitation game, which is a fourth da. And, that situates the game, so to speak, in the family affair of psychoanalysis, like the fourth da game happens in the context of Freud's observing his grandson. He's visiting his daughter, Sophie, and he observes his grandson play this game and interprets the child throwing the real and then recouping it as an effort to master the absence of something, the mother's absence. And I really think that disinvitations are an attempt to negotiate something about what has gone missing in psychoanalysis. And kind of like the mother of psychoanalysis, I don't want to play too much on the family metaphor because this has all kinds of problems, or the mother and kind of like all of that. Like there's many feminist critiques that we could have to that. But at the core of psychoanalysis is its own decenteredness, is its own radicality. It's the unconscious's resistance to the ego and to known form. So Laplanche has this formulation that we end up having a sexual unconscious by virtue of translation, and what the ego fails to translate. The failure of translation constitutes the sexual unconscious. But I've been writing recently about how, if we put that together with Black Studies and Fred Moten's work on fugitivity, we can actually think of the unconscious not as the result of a botched operation, but as this resistive core, not resistive from a place of I resist this or that, but resisting an energetic resistance to the forces of organization, order, regulation, including effective regulation. It's not for nothing that psychoanalysis is so enamored right now with effective regulation.
Yes.
I think it goes very much with the ethics of dysregulation should concern us more. But instead, what we do around that is diagnose splitting or diagnose polarization and repair, especially. So, bring this idea that just like with a game with a reel, people will be brought back, but be brought back on the terms of the person who's bringing them back. That's kind of like the quality of mastery in the game. But I think that part of why we are appealing and why we're invited in the first place is perhaps precisely because we have this capacity to bring in something that is unbinding and dysregulating to the organization.
One of the things that, and I should say that we read a number of your talks and essays in preparation for this conversation. And the moment in all of these that, and you spoke to it briefly before, but I want to just make sure that it's at the forefront of our listeners' minds, is that moment in the conversation in this sort of invitation, disinvitation back and forth, where you were essentially accused of this need to say the word genocide. And I really want to see, like, that for me was one of the most just sort of like, I'm thinking, I've been thinking a lot about this just because some of what I've been teaching this semester. I'm thinking about Sarah Ahmed's formulation of like the person who points out the problem becomes the problem, which I think is really, really salient here. And so in that moment, like you became the problem by what is being diagnosed essentially as like, well, why do you have to use that word? And I really want to make sure we get to talk about the profound resistance.
So I'm thinking about what you're saying about Sarah Ahmed, and I'm thinking also of Lara Sheeha's work on the feminist killjoy and the importance of remaining antagonistic to institutions.
Yeah.
And I think that you're absolutely right about what you're saying about the institutions and the organizations' profound resistance. I'm thinking about how the IPA will make statements about Russia, but will not make a single statement about Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
But I would actually say that the problem is not the resistance. The problem is that we act as if there shouldn't be resistance.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That's the psychoanalytic insight.
Yes.
That of course the problem is not that they say to me, you have a need to speak about the genocide. The problem is that they don't have a need to speak about the genocide.
Yes.
And that the problem that they invited me to problematize, not as an object of contemplation, but as action, as the action that transference also is, right? The way in which something becomes dramatized in the encounter is what they don't want to be involved in. So my problem with psychoanalysis right now is not that it's not open enough or that it shuts down. It's that it does not appreciate its own principles, which is that work and thinking proceeds precisely in the domain of disorientation rather than of coming together and dialogue and bridging differences. Like, no, that's never what psychoanalysis was about. The idea of foreignness, the irritant, the idea of the otherness in us, our own alterity, the alterity of the other. Like, we need, of course, what else are institutions going to do other than try to self-preserve and double down? That's why I'm insisting that for me, the problem is not that they say that I have a need. The problem is that they are not prepared for the disruption that they're actually inviting.
I think there's something about the specifically overdetermined character of the enactment in question, which is so clearly symptomatic, so clearly dispositive of something structural, even if there's no way to talk about it that doesn't make the person talking about it sound like it's all personal for them, because what else could it be in some ways? But it's again, I'm reaching for other analogies of, I think, like, when lawyers fight, do they continually threaten to sue one another? I don't know. When astrological associations implode, are they like telling each other's fortunes and reading the stars aggressively and passive aggressively? I don't know. But I do know
you just must be in your Saturn return.
Yeah, exactly. Mercury retrograde for you. Like, there's something though that about this particular type of kind of control of the relation. It clearly does so much work and means so much that it's not just when, and here I think of like those examples of like, I guess we don't really do this very much anymore on the same TV networks now that they've all split themselves, but like you'd have like a crossfire thing where you'd have Tucker Carlson and some liberal, and they'd show up every week and they'd fight, they'd take these positions, and then in the commercial break, they'd, well, we can all agree on this, or they'd go have drinks, or they'd laugh, right? Here, there's something about not just like the refusal to metabolize, but the layering of the resistances and the putting on the other, and this sort of flight to just even sit with antagonism.
Yes.
That is so clearly against the grain of what's supposed to happen, right? When I try to define, like, give minimal definitions of psychoanalytic practice to introductory students in Freud, I'm like, well, it's two people who are agreeing that anything that happens in the room is okay, provided that they don't, there's some bar, there's some limit, like they're not going to sleep together, right? Like they're not going to, there's some structure here. The idea that there could be even more exclusions and structures, but that are unwritten yet continually talked around between psychoanalysts, is so clearly, well, something is going on there. Sabouge, right? Something's moving.
Yeah, and that's why I think we should not idealize institutions, but we should also not idealize psychoanalysts, just because psychoanalysts are also fucked up in their own ways. And like so this it's not, so again, like my interest is not in, oh, some people are resisting and people should not be resisting. It is, why would we not expect that kind of resistance? Why do we not sign up for that fight? Like people say to me, why do you accept invitations in places that might disinvite you? And I think that, White, for example, did a conference a year after the disinvitation of Sheeha and Feluke Taylor, that Lara Sheeha and Feluke Taylor. They did a panel on irreverence, like really congratulating themselves for how much they welcome irreverence. And they invited me to speak about it. And when I was discussing the invitation, I said, just so you know what I'll say, this is what I'll be saying, just like I did with the Freud Museum. And they said to me, please come and say it. And of course, when I said it, there was a lot of resistance and a lot of pushback. But people say to me all the time, why do you go? Why do you even engage? And I'm thinking, because that's where the fight is. It's in the engagement. And it's in creating the crisis and in what I am thinking of as keeping the wound open, not allowing the wound to close. Because when you were saying, Patrick, like this is like in the consulting room, it's about anything happening. I mean, theoretically, yes. But clinically, I can't tell you how many supervisors, very well-respected people in the field talk about the consulting room as if it's a place of just relationality and connection, as if it's not a place where lines are not drawn. And I don't mean this, I feel like I need to clarify this. I don't mean this in the sense of we go into the consulting room and we try to convince our patients or about politics. I am very pro-trans. I am very concerned about Palestinian liberation, but I don't lead with that in the consulting room. But it comes up. It comes up when the patient talks about their Zionist family, or they talk about what it's like that they can't leave a bad boyfriend. Mm-hmm. And they wonder what keeps them tied together. These are not only personal, they're also, we are trained to read these moments as also alluding to other things. So we don't actually have to bring politics into the room. Politics are always already in the room. It is us who don't want to deal with that. So I really want to emphasize that for me, it's really important to remember what psychoanalysis really is, and that it is not this increasingly docile terrain where conversations can happen across difference. It's also about fighting with each other, like the controversial discussions is a really interesting moment where people are really fighting and they believe in the stakes of what they're fighting, rather than psychoanalysis decaying into this amoral, outside of the world, completely disconnected from. We have people in our psychoanalytic institutions in good standing, like ICPLA has in good standing the founder of an anti-trans hate group that SEGAM, that the Southern Poverty Law Center has described as an anti-trans hate group. Like this is what we want to be doing in our field. Like, what does it mean? And here I'm going to go to Sophie Lewis, to draw lines of enmity, and to draw lines of enmity not from the position of my opinion versus, like, we all have opinions, but from the position of ethics. Like, how is psychoanalysis becoming so disconnected from questions of ethics? And that is a fight. That is unbinding. It is not the death-driven destruction. People would much rather talk about it as the death drive that destroys institutions, breaks down things, as opposed to the enlivening dimension of unbinding.
Well, let me turn to a moment in your writing that is very much about this sort of unbinding. And also, I guess, to call back to yours and Patrick's kind of opening move, this is also a passage that is very much thinking about the temporal dimension of institutions and the ways in which we situate ourselves with respect to them in time. So this is a long passage, but I really would like our listeners to be able to hear it in your own words. This is from a talk called Genocide and the Screen of Irreverence, and it speaks directly to what you were saying 5-10 minutes ago about how your concern is, in fact, about institutions' lack of felt need to talk about genocide and to name it as such. Okay, so here is me quoting Avgi. When that time does come, the time when we will finally name and address our complicity as a field, we will be happy to discuss how our psychoanalytic institutions colluded in propagating the myth that it is only anti-Semitism that would motivate someone to protest a genocide. We will give papers about having abandoned our Palestinian colleagues and what that has to do with racial politics and settler colonialism. We will theorize what impact these violences in our field have had on our Arab colleagues and patients. So many Arab colleagues have been harmed in the past years by the unrestrained racialized animus they hear in classes and supervision, with all the racist tropes of the terrorist and other dehumanizing prejudices. We will be speaking about how Jewish colleagues and patients did not have the opportunity to use psychoanalytic insights to help them process the major crisis that it is to have to rethink one's history and one's relationship to the ethno-nationalist project of Israel. We will have serious thinking to do about having failed Jewish colleagues who have all along been opposing this genocide precisely in the name of their Jewish values, only to be told they are bad Jews who have internalized anti-Semitism. And we will have to take responsibility for our Jewish colleagues who have not dared voice their opposition for fear of such accusations. What a missed opportunity that we don't get to think with empathy and in real time about how it is that a people that was itself genocided is now self-righteously conducting its own racial extermination. What a shame that we have missed the chance to understand how the level of annihilatory anxiety that justifiably accompanies the memory of the Shoah and the existential panic that rapidly overtakes some Jewish people when Israel is being criticized are not historical inevitabilities, but psychic responses about which we, as analytic thinkers, might have something to say. What a loss to have failed to probe how routinely and matter-of-factly anti-colonial resistance has been conflated with anti-Semitism, or worse, with accusations of terrorism, as the Trump administration has been trying to formalize and legislate. All of these are things we will talk about, but about which we are not talking now. And this hurts our patients, it hurts us as clinicians and as a field, it hurts our peers and our students and our supervisees, and it hurts the world to which we as psychoanalysts also have a responsibility. This is a responsibility that coming generations will have to contend with, just as present generations are beginning to contend with the harm psychoanalysis has done and is continuing to do to queer people, to trans people, and to people of color. There will be conferences that take up our guilt, papers that will take stock of our inaction and of our complicity, that will try to sort out how psychoanalysis worked alongside, not against, fascism. Close quote. How do you account, Avgi, for this, what you call this missed opportunity, even in the context of, what we've been discussing as, ostensibly progressive psychoanalytic institutions? Do you see it as fundamentally in continuity with the history of this? I mean, you call it a field, call it a discipline, call it what you want. Why has the use of the word genocide been so staunchly resisted in so many psychoanalytic contexts?
I mean, I will take up your first two questions first, and thank you for reading this long quote. I wrote this segment with such anger, but also with such pain about the damage that we're doing and how we are ourselves hurt, not to put ourselves like prioritizing the self, and how we are doing damage to the world and damage to our field by not just not having the ethical stakes front and center, but even more problematically by trying to pretend that we're also doing the right thing. It would be one thing if psychoanalysis was saying, you know what, we're too frightened. Like we're going to get whatever the excuse or the justification is, we're going to get our funding withdrawn if you're state funded, which of course psychoanalytic institutes are. We're going to get targeted, or we are afraid we're going to lose too many members because too many people are still struggling with how to figure out Zionism versus settler colonialism here. But that's not what they're saying. They're hiding behind concepts and excuses. So the IPA said, we can't make a statement about Palestine because we have a charitable status. There's actually a call for resignations from the IPA right now for what I'm about to say. But they've made statements about October 7th. They've made statements about Russia and the Ukraine. They've made statements about trans issues. So, the Palestine exception, both in our organizations and in the consulting room where I can't tell you how many supervisees, students, and patients who I will actually call refugees have fled other treatments, other supervisions, looking for people who can work without diminishing them, without telling them that their people's efforts to protect their land mark them as terrorists and as bad and pathologizing, and that if they say it out loud, they become pariahs in our organizations. So I think that this is a missed opportunity that one for sure has to do with the history of psychoanalysis. Like when the German Psychoanalytic Association kicked out Jewish analysts, the IPA was silent, and Ernest Jones was very happy to congratulate the IPA for not becoming embroiled in politics. And in the panel where I gave the paper from which you quoted, Abby, I was on a panel with Adam Phillips and Joel Whitebook, and Joel Whitebook said, I have been alive long enough to have been present during the Vietnam War. And he said psychoanalysis was cowardly then too. Nobody said anything during the Vietnam War. Nobody. I mean, most people, like the major organizations, were not taking positions. And still, I want to say, I don't want to be exaggerating. There are people who are speaking out about Palestine right now, but it is not done on an institutional level. Like in my institute, our then director told us that that NYU has prohibited the word genocide from being used on the listserv. And therefore, when somebody used the word genocide, they closed down the listserv. And that was absolutely not true when that was said. So much for like free speech, right? Or what kinds of like academic freedom matters. But it is not only very much in our history as psychoanalytic organizations, it is also in our history to believe that institutions will save us, or that they are the grown-ups to which this whole infantilization of candidates does not just work for diminishing them, because trainees in our field are people sometimes in their 30s, sometimes in their 50s, like grown-ass people. I'm sorry, but they're treated as children. And this is not just about treating them as children. It's also about the institution establishing itself as the parent. It is also about imagining that you will grow into a family when family is the place where most damage, as we know. I'm thinking also again of like Sophie's work here about abolishing the family, as if the family will take care of you. And the faith that we put on institutions. So for me, yes, institutions are not speaking up, and it's a huge problem. And organizations are speaking around these issues or talking about, we condemn violence on all sides, as if violence is equal on all sides, or as if there aren't ethical stakes about which violence we're talking about. So the violence of self-defense versus the violence of, like, what are the ethics of violence? Like, we can't have conversations about this in psychoanalysis. So for sure, psychoanalysis is kind of like quite conservative in this way. And by conservative, I also mean organizations want to conserve themselves, but it is incumbent on us to resist. And one of the things that I've been trying to write about lately is how psychoanalysis has so much to say about fascist ascendancy, about like the emergence of violence and the conditions under which things, kind of like war erupts, but very little developed and discussed theory about resistance. How do we resist? What psychic processes? And I think, it is in that spirit that I want to talk about invitations and disinvitations, and why I say we should allow ourselves to get disinvited rather than guard ourselves. So yes, there's a continuity. And as for I also want to go to your other question about genocide and why it's a word that has been so staunchly resisted. I don't think that it's resisted overall. In other words, it's not that there's a developed discourse in psychoanalysis about the genocide in Rwanda, but there have not been formal statements or listservs shut down about how we can't use the word genocide for Rwanda. This is very specific to Palestine. Right? The use of the word genocide to speak about racial extermination in psychoanalysis is very specific to thinking about Palestinians. And I think it's very specific to the proprietary relationship that Zionism has to the word genocide, which, I was speaking recently to somebody who has a high position in one of these international psychoanalytic organizations. And he said to me, in so many words, this is not exactly a quote, but this is an accurate rendition of what he said. He said, we have people of many different opinions in an organization, as if this is a constituency and you're running an election, as if this is a political organization, you're just trying to get voted into office. Like, what does that mean? So for me, it's really about divesting from institutions. You may stay in institutions for whatever reason. It's really about emotional divestment, like stopping to believe that the institution will save you or will do the right thing. It's not about reformism. People make decisions, strategic decisions about staying affiliated or not staying affiliated. So, my decision has been to disaffiliate from most organizations that I've been connected to, and I'm about to resign from the IPA for these precise reasons. But my point is more also about the psychic relationship that we have to organizations.
There's so much in what you just said, and I find myself feeling so many things at once. Starting with how much I share your contempt for pretense, right? And I'm not saying that like Lord knows fascists lie all the time, and I'm not saying that this is you got to hand them anything, right? Yet when you're in antagonism with them, like the real kind, they're pretty fucking frank about it.
Yes.
And again, that is what it is. The appeals by way of like a flight into intellectualization that also function on an affective level as essentially like self-soothing, right? Or like conjuring some kind of false comedy. Like, well, we can all agree about this. Or this kind of like, well, you don't really mean that, do you? Or you're just doing that for the cameras. Like you're making a spectacle for yourself, right? It's, well, I would almost respect some of the analytic players on the table here more if they would just name the phobic object in the full fantasy that they are experiencing. And I'll be crude about this, but if they were just like, well, look, I mean, I can't bear the thought of you're wearing a keffiyeh because immediately, I mean, just like, I'm waiting for you to detonate a suicide vest. Like, I can't have you on this stage. I'm sorry. That's like, that would have, again, it's a different type of, call it honesty or candor than the fascists, but at least it would be something, or at least something that could be, well, even naming it kind of deflates it, right? It becomes like this kind of, oh, well, aren't I silly about it? Like my distress and my fantasy suddenly become less through that articulation rather than by appealing to some other meta discourse or trying to diagnose you. And it's on that level that I can't help but also think about that as coexisting with like this kind of half awareness, with the unconscious awareness of, well, I'll give people perhaps more credit sometimes than they deserve. Like, I think that there are probably people who might intellectually be capable of saying, well, on a structural level, the institution of the heteronormative family requires the creation of an phobic object that's also always a threat. And also, mutatis mutandis, the social reproduction of the ethno-nationalist state requires the creation of erased indigenous populations that are, stateless and continually, I guess like expropriated and dispossessed in that kind of primitive accumulation mode. In other words, people could say intellectually, like bigotry towards trans people and a hatred of Palestinians is structurally necessary to these formations. And if these people did not individually exist, we would have to invent them as categories in order to maintain that. And yet, even if, and maybe this is too much credit, people could say that intellectually, there is still some sort of ethical failure. And I mean this in like even almost that full Lacanian sense, right? You're coming, even as you're gesturing towards a limit, you're refusing to go with them to that limit and instead trying to pull them back.
Yeah.
And that is, it's hard not to, you can see it in other places. I think about a lot of like, it's easier for other people to think about like the discourses of punditry, right? Well, both sides, like it appeals to metaphor, like, well, both sides do this, or like this kind of like the weird way in like handedness, like, well, there's a left and there's a right. And because we have like, symmetry in our bow plans, we must also have like, that's also like the yin and yang of the universe. And of course, it's purely formalist nonsense. But it feels like again, I almost want to, if you'll forgive me, like to name like the fantasy object where it's like, I can just get out of history, right? I don't have to, if I position myself somehow, like even like verbally to myself, if I position myself in relation to the institution, I will be saved even if the institution fails.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Again, this is if you forgive me on the wild hair, I found myself thinking about and just now double checking this fragment from Kafka, if you will. Can I just read you this? It's just,
Go for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is from Kafka, and it's on parables, and perhaps some people know this already.
Oh, yeah.
Many complain that the words of the wise are always merely parables and of no use in daily life, which is the only life we have. When the sage says, go over, he does not mean that we should cross to some actual place, which we could do anyhow if the labor were worth it. He means some fabulous yonder, something unknown to us, something, too, that he cannot designate more precisely, and therefore cannot help us here in the very least. All these parables really set out to say merely that the incomprehensible is incomprehensible, and we know that already. But the cares we have to struggle with every day, that is a different matter. And now here's the bit that makes me think, for some reason, I'm seeing this for the first time as an analytic encounter, and also it's expressing this fantasy desire. Concerning this, so we got this parable, and now we have a parable at the parable. A man once said, why such reluctance? If you only followed the parables, you would yourselves become parables, and with that be rid of all your daily cares. Another said, I bet that is also a parable. The first said, you have won. The second said, but unfortunately only in parable. And the first replied, no, in reality, in parable you have lost.
Oh my God, this is such a fascinating segment. Makes me think of what you were saying earlier about how if there was less pretense, at least if people said it, like the intellectual, and then there's the affective part, right? Like that these word games are also affective games, but they're presenting themselves as just games of reason, as if ongoing dialogue. And I know that you did an episode on this with, was it Adrian Daub?
Mm-hmm.
Like free speech and the question of what is this, thinking about the moral panics associated with thinking about the cancellation. That on the other side of we just keep talking about it's just cancellation, which is the right wing the right wing weaponization of this. But in psychoanalysis, we call that splitting. So, what I was going to say is that, you were saying earlier, at least the right owes its pretense. The right also owns its aggression. Yeah. And we don't want to do aggression. We just want to do good politics. This is one of the reasons why I'm actually writing about sadism right now and trying to recoup sadism from its destructive, from it being only seen as a destructive force, which it can also be, to actually help us think a little bit about the ethics of unbinding. And, I was talking earlier about the ethics of dysregulation. One of my significant interventions in the trans antagonism paper, which this was the paper that was canceled by ICPLA, where Roberto D'Angelo, the leader of this SPLC designated anti-trans group, held it was going to be done there, and that's the institution that canceled it. And that talk was going to be against trans antagonism. And one of my most significant interventions there was to say that we need to stop debating some people. We need to stop doing the both siderism around transness and to stop engaging in conversations with people whose anti-trans activism in the actual world has had damaging effects, like demonstrably damaging effects. Segem, they sent an amicus brief in this Chromatic case. David Bell, the great Kleinian that psychoanalysis so reveres, was instrumental and has been thrilled and explicit about having been effective in closing down the Tavistock gender service clinic in the UK. So what does it mean for us to keep having conversations in the interest of ongoing dialogue and debate? So my intervention there was to say that the fear has always been that people will get canceled. Mm-hmm. But yes, all opinions exist, but they don't all matter the same way. Or which is another way of saying that we need to be exercising our judgment and critical faculties to decide which opinions matter to us as professionals, as people who work with people, as people who have an impact in the world, who the world looks to mental health to give an opinion. It shouldn't, but it does, to give an opinion on trans issues. These are wildly consequential issues. These are not just intellectual debates, they're ethical projects. So it makes me think of how routinely our field turns principled disagreement over problematic ideas into splitting. That's where I was trying to go with that. Patrick, and its constant exhortation to repaint the splits and hostilities. So for me, I've been thinking a lot about redoing the foundations of psychoanalysis, and very much in the spirit of Laplanche, who also calls for a renewing of the foundations, but redoing the foundations in a way that orients us much more seriously towards unbinding and unrest. Splitting has become psychoanalysis's most potent moralizing code, as the place from which only non-mature, non-integrated psychic subjects speak. It gives people the tools with which to say that any taking of a ground or taking of a stance is actually perhaps an indication of being psychically non-mature and being like not having reached the depressive position. And these are some of the things that we need to redo. I'm not arguing for throwing all of that out. I think we need to, but I am calling for a real reconfiguration of these ideas in a way that doesn't make them usable in this way.
There's a line or a few lines from the talk about trans antagonism that are very much about this sort of divestment, the need for divestment, that I want to read really quickly, where you say, if I keep repeating this point, stop debating and dialoguing with anti-trans colleagues. This is because refusing to participate in dialogue goes against deep-seated psychoanalytic and indeed liberal political norms. A critical disaffiliation from the concept of dialogue with such colleagues is important because it is urgent that we divest from conversations that are not meant to expand our analytic understanding of trans kids, but to constrict queer and trans life. We need to release ourselves from our fascination with debate, which can pull us into trans skepticism, close quote. And I have to tell you that I was immersing myself in your work and in this paper at the same time that I was preparing to teach John Stuart Mill, and specifically chapter 2 of On Liberty, to give first-year college students an introduction to what is kind of the text for exactly those like liberal procedural norms of like civil, like hear me saying like civil discourse, right? And like you got to hear all sides. And in fact, like even includes a passage about how if you want to be able to truly master your argument, you have to be able to inhabit that of your, well, he doesn't say enemy, but let's for the sake of what we're talking about, think of as at least your antagonist. And I was thinking about that alongside a piece that I have loved and that I have used, a humor piece from Danny Lavery from the sadly now defunct site, The Toast, which is, your request to hear both sides has been denied. And I don't have it with me because I think The Toast is down now, but there is a line that it's sort of like, just the one side will have to do for now. Like, and there it goes, but in the mode of humor. And I've assigned this to students in the past to sort of defang this idea that is, I think, so intuitive that like we need to give every single perspective a fair hearing, regardless of what that means for the outcome of conversations. Something that it's on the face of it, it seems so hard to disagree with. The like, why wouldn't we want to hear all of these opinions, right? Because it just gets flattened into the idea. I mean, it requires such a good faith understanding of people and their motivations for holding certain views.
Yeah, but also we've heard those opinions.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's nothing new.
We've heard them. It's that we're not trying to like.
Oh yeah, I'm not being a John Stuart Mill
I know,
here.
I know. What I'm saying is that it's like when it comes to trans issues or when it comes to kind of like concerns about violence, we know these opinions. There's nothing new there.
Yeah.
Right. So the question is, what does it mean to continue to engage them? I think that's the issue. What does it mean to argue for its continued engagement. And I'm so interested that you were bringing in Mills in this context, because you give us the basis from which this liberal kind of thinking proceeds. Mm-hmm. In psychoanalysis, it proceeds precisely from the depressive position.
Yes.
Like, there is Caroline Laubender in her recent book on the political clinic, traces how Melanie Klein's work with Richard. There is a moment where in her work with Richard, who is a child who has been evacuated during World War II, is tussling with how to understand Nazism. And there is the moment that the child is able to understand the perspective of Nazis is the moment that for Klein is his true attainment of the depressive position. This is what we might think of as the trial identification that not in this language Mills invites when he says, like, you have to try to see it as them, from them. So this is not just about understanding, it's also about building an affective bridge, right? An identification bridge. And the idea that there's something mature about understanding where a genocider is coming from, and that should give us not understanding, but also kind of like a more democratic approach to opinion making, mm-hmm. is incredibly problematic. I'm not saying that like a dedicated Zionist who's in the IDF does not have a psychology, or that we might not probe their psychology, or Patrick was saying earlier, like, how do we understand the pretense, like what happens in some people's mind? These are all very interesting, but I think not at the expense of thinking of how we resist, because so often we're so interested in the mind of the aggressor, but not in the mind of the resistor, or the effective ingredients that go into making for resistance.
I'm thinking here about Edward Said's Freud and the Non-European, right? Another one of these texts that's invited to be delivered, and then I think it's the Freud Museum, right, that disinvites him, and then it's
in Vienna.
Yeah, published with a lovely essay by Jacqueline Rose. And this kind of way in which speaking the terms that you are feels, and like it should be legible, but is also so legible in terms of a real and complicated relationship to the legacy of Freud too, right? I mean, who is a figure who has hardly a straightforward relationship to his Jewishness, or and certainly a deeply ambivalent in both idiosyncratic and popular and technical senses towards the Zionist project, right? And who was a refugee himself. And as you write beautifully in one of your pieces, it was struggling only at the point at which his Anna Freud was nearly killed by the Gestapo, which is like, okay, maybe I do need to leave Vienna. Like, these are not abstract questions present at the inception of this discipline. And I kind of want to ask, and I mean, it's just, I'm just trying to, forgive me if this is almost impossible to say, but like, what is the terror, right? Like, what's the all these like, well, we have to identify with a Nazi. We have to, even if that makes us, abetting them, we have to continue to entertain things that we've already dealt with. You've put it in terms of like a desire to be mature, or to seem mature, or to feel that you've arrived at a developmental stage. I think maybe other disciplines, it's like, you got to be serious, right? That's one of if you really want to like activate the irreverence of a lot of professions, make them feel unserious. And I wonder if there's something specifically psychoanalytic or something specific to psychoanalysts about this, like, what if I just had to be here in this? Like, what's the scenario that's being dreaded, right? Is it like a kind of like a borderline collapse? Is it just a straight up panic attack? Is it a magical thinking that somehow, I don't know, telling the Nazi to fuck off, Nazi punks go home, somehow will produce another like Third Reich? I still can't. Yeah.
I mean, I have a thought about this that's like, I really love that question. I think it gets at the core of it. Let me think through it out loud.
Yeah, of course.
Because my first impulse is to say that it has something to do with our own difficulty with aggression and with our own hatred. And not as a hatred that needs to be metabolized, but as a hatred that needs to be preserved. Like, we so love our metaphors of metabolizing and containing and transforming and symbolizing in psychoanalysis. But if we're going to take what Freud gives us in his original conception of the death drive, where the death drive is also a libidinal force. The death drive is not a libidinal force, but aggressivity and cruelty are libidinal forces. Before he separates it out before sexuality becomes cleaned out of that and becomes narcissism and self-love and love for the other, before he gives us in Beyond the Pleasure Principle like the remains of what was left out of this. I mean, this is Laplanche's critique, right? The remains of what's left out of sexuality, like the more destabilizing demonic elements, he gives them to us, he repackages them as a different drive. And that drive is actually quite inert in the sense that, you know, to invoke the death drive is to concede that there exists in us a force that is so dark and so evil and so destructive that, yes, it's extremely upsetting, but really, like, if you're educated and psychoanalytically informed, it's ultimately understandable. So in a way, the notion of the death drive, the fear that we're going to be drawn towards destructiveness is also a way to try to conquer and pacify and exonerate destructiveness. And that this is one of the things that, you know, before we started, you were saying that you're working on a book on the death drive, and I'm super excited about that, because so much is not done around the death drive as an enlivening force. And we are so terrified of it. But if we're not going to say, I hate the Nazi, what is the alternative to not moving towards a depressive position? It is maintaining the splitting off, not good and bad, but the connection with hatred. And the idea that this is something that we have to get over and that this is a problem has done tremendous damage in psychoanalysis. Obviously, not just in psychoanalysis, this is everywhere. The right is very comfortable with its aggression. I'm not valorizing it. I'm not saying it's great. I'm just saying we don't have a relationship to it. Like in our fantasy, we're just going to get rid of it. So, and what kinds of political positioning can happen through that? Just the politics of acquiescence, you know, being lulled into a sedative politics. So, you know, all of our education towards metabolizing like aggressivity and metabolizing conflict really very predictably takes us in Mill's direction. Right?
Yeah, like we try to become parables and then we lose.
We should be unbearable.
Before we go, Avgi, I know you wear a lot of hats all of the time, but I wonder if we can really like shift into the clinical register. And I'm thinking about your piece, which is called Just Say Genocide, where you write about these clinical encounters. And so I'll read briefly. Like many other psychoanalysts, I have sat in the past year with Jewish students, patients, and colleagues who have been confronted post October 7th by facts that forced them to re-examine an entire worldview in which their identity is also wrapped up. Having to process the budding realization that in this genocide, Jewish people are not the victims, but the perpetrators is a hard reality to stomach. How does one metabolize the fact that history appears to have turned back on itself, such that the Zionist state will now be remembered as having perpetrated a racial extermination? To do so requires incredible courage, moral strength, and considerable psychic resources, because what is involved is not only being convinced by the facts, but importantly, the psychic project of relinquishing one's libidinal attachments to an understanding of Jewishness as being tied to the Zionist project. How does one relinquish one's proprietary relationship to the word genocide? How does one break the fantasy of singularity that ostensibly sets the Shoah apart from other large-scale catastrophic human suffering? This propertized relationship to the Holocaust plays a key role in why many people bristle at the word genocide, why even those who concede to the enormity of Israeli aggression refuse to use this word. And you then conclude the piece as follows by saying of people who are doing this work to confront these realities, such confrontations are, simply put, psychically brutal, which is perhaps why Stefan Zweig described in his correspondence with Freud the reckoning with truth that psychoanalysis engenders as truth sadism. At stake with truth sadism is not a skin-deep reassessment of the situation, but a psychic shift of seismic proportions that involves nothing less than a transformation of the self, a disordering and reordering of one's entire relationship to one's Jewishness, to one's connections with other Jews, including one's family and loved ones. The psychoanalyst Dominique Scarfone has described transformations of that scale as a dismembering and a remembering of the self, close quote. And I read all of this as I have been throughout this episode, because I want our listeners to hear you in your own written words, but also because, again, it brings us into the consulting room. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about your ongoing clinical work with folks who are working with what you call this seismic psychic reconfiguration?
Thank you for this question, because nowadays I'm rarely asked questions as a clinician, and I am a full-time clinician. And I think that these ideas have huge implications for clinical work. For one, I would say that people don't work with these seismic considerations, they suffer them. No, this essay that you were quoting from is not written for a psychoanalytic journal. So to speak in more psychoanalytic language, here I'm talking really about what Laplanche describes as translation and detranslation. And detranslation, Laplanche writes about how the scope of analysis is not synthesis or pulling bits together, even though a lot of what we do in our work is that. He says that really what analysis is about the lytic dimension of the work. So when I'm talking about people relinquishing their attachments, I'm not talking about something that is intentionally set down or something that a person decides they have to give up. But things are, in a way, you have to claw your way out of yourself, in a way. Like, it has to be taken out of your hands, not by the analyst, not by the clinician. You yourself have to, like this, I'm thinking of Jewish patients of mine. I'm actually giving a talk about one of these patients in next 2 weeks, who are encountering the genocide and who are slowly allowing themselves to come into contact with information, but also with the effective force in the protests, in their colleagues. I can't tell you how many people who have really struggled, for example, with people like Lara Shiha, have also found themselves in my consulting room in the aftermath of their upset, rethinking things that she said or rethinking her affect. This is one way to think about temporality.
Yeah.
And I think this is also why Lara is so dangerous to the establishment and why she's been so hunted, really, by the state and by psychoanalytic institutions, who in these encounters, they believe to feel that the chafing of their own worldview against something else. And when I say worldview, I don't mean this intellectually. Like in our worldviews, and I try to write this about this in Sexuality Beyond Consent, are also our bodies and our attachments to others and our relationship to this world. So we're talking about nothing less than a reconfiguration of the self. We're talking about nothing less than a huge crisis of what in Sexuality Beyond Consent I've called overwhelm. And so many clinicians have responded to the potential crisis escalation of their patients around genocide, but also around what's happening right now with ICE and fascism in this country, or with the ways in which trans people's driver's license were recently revoked. The standard therapeutic response is to try to contain and process and work through something. And I think that this acts antinomically to the crisis that I've seen some patients come into the work that I'm doing and that other colleagues are doing, that actually has the possibility to produce this enormous undoing of the self, this detranslation, in the aftermath of which the patient has to restitch themselves in a different way. And this is not about the patient it's not about influence or the patient becoming who the analyst wants them to become. It's not about trying to impose one's political positions. I have to say these things because that's how I'm usually read when I write politically. People think that I go into the clinic and tell my patients what to do politically, or that I share my opinions with them, which is not what I do. But I do really believe in the possibility of detranslation. So that's why I said that this is, even the word relinquishment sounds too tame in relation to what I think this look like in the consulting room, like people who are thinking, what am I going to do with my family? Not just what am I going to say to them if you've grown up in a Zionist family. How do I explain myself? How do they not feel they've lost me? How do I not lose them? What if I transform and they don't? Like these are questions with very consequential decisions. And they're not just about like politics. They're also about what expectations parents have of their children, what expectations children have of their parents, about what kinds of relationships we forge with each other. Where does difference reside in relationships? What is bearable and what is unbearable? So for me, these kinds of seismic transformations are resisted all too often in the consulting room. As I was saying earlier, they're resisted in psychoanalytic institutions, or when the Freud Museum disinvites Edward Said, the same Freud Museum, by the way, also Vienna, right? My colleague, Zach Samelin, said to me when I was disinvited, to be disinvited by the Austrian Museum is the most, it's the best compliment for a psychoanalyst.
Yeah, you're in good company there, yeah.
But when he was disinvited on account of, because he was of the photograph, as we know, throwing a stone against an Israeli soldier. And he was disinvited precisely for being an engaged Palestinian. And this question of engagement, of not talking around things, of theory not just being theory, but being theory with teeth, theory for action, including the action of political resistance. How do you say to your family, something is not adding up here? These are huge crises, and they don't happen fast. They don't happen at the temporality that we want political change to happen. Certainly the temporality of the consulting room is entirely different. But for me, these ideas have tremendous ramifications for a revitalized psychoanalysis that is saved from its tendency to try to its tendency towards closure, to use another Laplanchian term, narcissistic closure.
Before we go, Avgi, can you tell us a little bit about the quite new organization that you're involved with the remarkably sassy name of P-hole?
Thank you for asking that, and for we actually came up with a name before we came up with the acronym. We really fit the acronym into the name. We really wanted something provocative. So P-hole stands for, it turns out, the Psychoanalytic Hub for Online Liberatory Education, and I founded it together with Adrian Sanchez and Nicole Nelson and Anne Pellegrini. In response actually to an institute having its origin stories. An institute had invited somebody many of us were very concerned, is a transphobic speaker. The institute reached out to several of us asking for our opinions. And then, I kid you not, it's from the Oregon Center of Psychoanalysis. And they had invited Alessandra Lemma, who many of us had concerns about. And then we were reached out to by some of the organizers, and we expressed our concerns. And then they told us, this is the I kid you not part, we decided we're not going to disinvite her, but what we will do is we will start working right away on a letter of apology to the trans community.
Jesus Christ.
Right? I mean, this is how much repair matters. I mean, this is what repair is being used to do, right?
Yeah.
To launder the reputation of an institute that knows that it may be about to do something that is problematic.
It's like the mirror image of the invitation disinvitation structure.
Yes, exactly.
Like, repair doesn't mean getting to have things both ways. Like, that's not what it means.
That's exactly right. That's actually very well put. It's exactly having your cake and eating it too. So not wanting to deal with what it means to say, we're going to take a stand and disinvite this person. Because, we've been talking about disinvitations, but I'm not against disinvitations. Like, I think it matters who you disinvite and why, and what the stakes are. I mean, I would much rather some people are not invited at all if people had the discernment to not invite people who are transphobic. But so anyway, we were very upset with this development. And we said, you know what? Instead of, like I was saying to you earlier, Patrick, instead of trying to understand where they're coming from and do they mean, oh my God, how terrible, like all of these things that we've said to each other a million times before, why don't we not do that and just do something resistive? Why don't we just do our own educational initiative? So it's not an organization, it's an educational initiative. We approached clinicians, starting out only people of color, trans and queer clinicians, basically those who have been mostly underrepresented and targeted by psychoanalytic organizations, and asked people to teach. And everybody we invited said yes. We were very lucky and very happy, and they were very enthusiastic. And instead of building a curriculum, we invited our faculty. So we said, what do you want to teach? We want you to teach whatever you want. It was so interesting because some of them have been so institutionalized. And this is something that they have said to us too. Like they were aware of it and touched by it, that they were saying to us, I could do this and I could do that. What do you want me to do? And we're like, no, seriously, we don't want to tell you. I mean, this is what institutionalization looks like. So it has been, we ended up having, we have 506 students from all over the world.
Oh, that's remarkable.
It's remarkable. And 1/3 of our students are registered for free. And the rest are paying, like, depending on ability. A lot of queer and trans people, a lot of people of color. And the curriculum is really psychoanalysis done differently through kind of like a pro-trans, anti-Zionist lens, thinking with liberation politics around class and ability. So it's been going very well. We teach every Sunday for 3 hours each. And we are trying to decide what we're going to do next year. But it's been lovely. We've had like people from like, I think, over 45 countries all over the world.
Wow.
It's really phenomenal. And it speaks to how hungry people are for a new kind of psychoanalysis. So we're super excited.
Oh, that's so inspirational.
Congratulations.
Yeah,
I mean,
wow.
that's just an incredible achievement. And I will share all of the information about P-Hole and its classes in the show notes for our listeners. Avgi, it is always such a joy not only to get to read you, but to get to speak with you for real. This has been, I hesitate to be like, this is a pleasure because of the material, but just to be in conversation with you.
But to speak for real, that's what it is. Like, speaking for real is not common.
Enlivening in the best possible sense.
Thank you both so much for having me.
Thank you so much, folks, for listening to this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. Ordinary Unhappiness is made possible and kept ad-free for everyone entirely through the generous support of our Patreon community. If you'd like to support the show and get an additional 2 Patreon-only episodes per month, please head on over to patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Avgi Saketopoulou. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.